The podcast you're about to listen to discusses content of serious nature, including descriptions of racial oppression and violence, which may be upsetting to some listeners. Please proceed with care. Beginning in the middle of the 17th century, European colonists established a brutal slave society at the southwestern tip of Africa that lasted for more than 150 years. The legacy of this period has affected the development of South Africa ever since, and it can still be felt today. This is A History of Slavery at the Cape. Part 5. Things Improve.
In 1795, the British took over control of the Cape from the Dutch for the first time. There were 16,839 privately owned enslaved people in the colony at that time. In 1803, the Dutch temporarily reoccupied the Cape of Good Hope for a short period of 3 years until the British took over for good. At that time, all of the enslaved people of the VOC were released from the slave lodge under the rule of the then governor, the Earl of Caledon. In 1814, the Cape officially became a British colony. The 19th century saw the end of slavery in the British Empire, of which the Cape Colony was now a part. In 1807, laws were passed in England that stopped the slave trade by the beginning of 1808. This meant enslaved people were no longer allowed to be imported. However, people who were already enslaved and their newborn children still remained enslaved and could still be sold. During the next few years, laws were passed to improve the lives of enslaved people. These laws were called the amelioration laws, and as a result, enslaved people were allowed to enter legal Christian marriages after 1824. Families of enslaved people were allowed to live together. Wives and husbands could not be separated, and their children not to be sold before a certain age. Enslaved people had to receive a reasonable amount of food, shelter, and clothing. The number of hours enslaved people could be made to work was limited. The punishment of enslaved people were more strictly controlled. Enslaved people were granted property rights, and those who worked in their free time could save up what they earned and buy freedom for themselves and their families, even against the wishes of their enslavers. It was during this period that the two uprisings of enslaved people in the Cape occurred. In both cases, the enslaved people demanded immediate freedom. Both of the uprisings failed. The first uprising took place in 1808. Two enslaved men, Louis van Mauritius and Abraham van die Kaap, met a couple of Irish sailors in a Cape Town tavern. The Irishmen told them that the oceanic slave trade was outlawed and that all enslaved people would soon be set free. They also told Louis and Abraham about countries such as Britain, where slavery did not exist. Louis van Mauritius and Abraham van die Kaap decided that it was time to fight for the freedom of all enslaved people in the Cape. They persuaded some 300 people living on farms in the Coburg region to march to the Cape and demanded freedom. Their march was stopped and dispersed by armed units dispatched from Cape Town when they reached Salt River. The leaders of the uprising included Louis van Mauritius and Abraham van die Kaap, were executed for their role in the rebellion. The Second Uprising took place in 1825 on a remote farm in the rural Bukkerveld. A number of enslaved people and co-laborers, led by gallant van die Kaap, killed several farmers and threatened to take over other farms in the region. They believed that emancipation had been promised by the government and that their owners were holding it back from them. The enslaved people involved were captured and Gallant was executed.
Part 6. The End of Enslavement. Katie Jacobs described finding out about her impending freedom to the newspaper reporter in 1910.
One evening, we were ordered to appear next morning in our best clothes and await further instructions. During the day, we marched into the dining room, and without any previous warning, we were told by a magistrate that in 4 years, we would be free. My father replied that 4 years was a long time, and he did not think he would live so long. My old father died in slavery, and so did not live to enjoy the God-given freedom which is the right of every human being.
It was only towards the later part of the 18th century, and especially the 19th century, that people in Europe started to think it was wrong to enslave people. In Britain, groups of people known as abolitionists campaigned for the end of slavery. In addition, growing slave resistance, ranging from individual acts of disobedience to massive slave rebellions, such as the Hightown Revolution from 1791 to 1803, also had a massive impact on views about slavery. Enslavers at the Cape were reluctant to set enslaved people free, as this would mean an enormous financial loss to them. Many of them felt that the government could not infringe on their rights, and they considered owning enslaved people to be their right. In the end, all enslaved people in the British Empire were officially freed on the 1st of December 1834. Emancipation did not mean immediate freedom for enslaved people, however. It was argued that they could not take care of themselves and had to get used to the freedom gradually. In addition, the government also wanted to give enslavers time to adapt. Enslaved people therefore had to work for another 4 years as so-called apprentices for their enslavers without pay. In many instances, they did exactly the same work under the same conditions. For this reason, many people regard the 1st of December 1838 as the real Emancipation Day. On that day, approximately 36,000 enslaved people in the Cape finally gained their freedom.
Katie Jacobs and her husband Jacob, it was simultaneously a day of joy and humiliation.
Jacob's boss was cruel and sjambocked his slaves as often as he fed them. He was mad with rage on the day of our emancipation. Early in the morning, he armed himself with a gun, mounted a horse, and drove every ex-slave off his farm. At the boundary, he warned them that the first one that was found trespassing on his land would be shot down.
The enslavers in the Cape Colony had protested against the end of slavery. In 1831, Stellenbosch enslavers rioted by refusing to accept the order to keep registers of punishment meted out to enslaved people, and in the following year, more than 2,000 enslavers assembled in Cape Town to hold a protest meeting. 1836 saw the start of the Great Trek by around 12,000 farmers who demonstrated their unhappiness about the government's policy to release enslaved people from the control of free burghers by migrating further inland and out of the Cape Colony. In 1843, the Voortrekker Anna Steenkamp, a niece of the Voortrekker leader Pieter Tief, ascribed the impetus for the Great Trek not only to the shameful and unjust proceedings with reference to the freedom of our slaves, but more particularly to their being placed on an equal footing with Christians, contrary to the laws of God and the natural distinction of race and color, so that it was intolerable for any decent Christian to bow down beneath such a yoke.
After protesting against the abolishment of slavery, the Cape enslavers eventually accepted the decision as inevitable. Registered enslavers at the Cape were compensated by the British government for their so-called losses. They were very concerned about the compensation they received for the enslaved people they owned, and were very unhappy about the amount of money they received. They received less than expected because the money had to be collected in London. In the end, £1.2 million were paid out by the British government in compensation money for the approximately 1,300 affected farmers at the Cape. While the former enslavers received some compensation for their losses, the enslaved people themselves received nothing to compensate for their pain and suffering of enduring generations of slavery to help them start a new life. They did not receive money, land, or training. That meant that many of them depended on their previous enslavers to find work after 1838. The words of a famous American abolitionist, Wendell Phillips, apply to this situation after the end of slavery in the Cape. When slavery was officially ended in the US, he said, quote, "We have abolished the slave. The master remains," unquote. In the Cape Colony too, the power relations between former enslaved people and former enslavers stayed very much the same. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people had no other choice than to work for their former enslavers under similar conditions and for low wages that would make it almost impossible to escape from poverty.
According to Katie Jacobs,
my master offered to take Jacob and me into his service at £1 and 10 shillings and 10 shillings a month respectively, and food and house. Jacob at first appeared determined to leave the district where he had suffered so much. My missus wept at the idea of my leaving her. "No, you must stay," she cried. "Think of my son, whom you have suckled and nursed, and who has now grown so fond of you. What will become of him? No, you must stay. You cannot go." Finally, my husband gave away, and we remained at the farm for 3 or 4 years.
The inequality between the wealthy white landowners and the poor black laborers that had been established under slavery was maintained and would largely remain in place throughout South Africa's history until the present day. While the transition to wage labor may have been comparatively smooth for former urban enslaved people, it was much harder for people who had been enslaved on farms in the rural areas. Many of these folks moved from the farms to the cities to find work. Formerly enslaved people continued to experience tight control, discrimination, and inequality after emancipation. Being free did not mean having the same opportunities as former enslavers. Only in 1996 did South Africa's post-apartheid Bill of Rights make it irrefutably clear that, quote, "No one may be subjected to slavery, servitude, or forced labor," unquote. But of course, the more than 175 years of slavery in the Cape had big effects which can still be seen today.
Part 7. The Legacy of Slavery in South Africa.
How did enslaved people and slavery influence South African history and culture? According to South African poet and academic Kabeba Badarun, not only is slavery in the Cape the ground on which apartheid was built, but it continues to shape the present in profound ways. Slavery was not just defined by its brutality, but also the incredible resilience of those it sought to dehumanize and erase. Today, the legacy of enslaved people survives as a vibrant cultural heritage in Cape Town, the Western Cape, and South Africa as a whole. Many South Africans who share an ancestry with enslaved people do not acknowledge this connection. Some observers believe that the collective trauma their ancestors experienced during slavery, being objectified and terrorized for generations, lead to great shame, and attempts to deal with this shame in the past may have resulted in collective attempt to forget it. For long stretches of the country's history, the descendants of enslaved people were told that they have nothing to show for as a community from the time of enslavement. The contributions enslaved people made to South Africa were denied and erased. This goes hand in hand with the racist claim that today's descendants of indigenous and enslaved people have no culture. Enslavement resulted in their humanity, culture, and community being diminished for generations. The fact is that many South Africans are descendants of enslaved people, and many South African families, both black and white, have enslaved people, indigenous Khoisan people, in their family trees. Many descendants of enslaved Khoi and San people would later officially be classified as colored in apartheid South Africa. Others were absorbed into white families, including many prominent Afrikaner families. In reality, people who came from Africa and Asia and from diverse cultural backgrounds with different languages, traditions, and religions contributed immeasurably to modern-day South Africa's vibrant culture and diversity. Today, for instance, many people believe that the development of the Afrikaans language can be attributed to enslaved people. The home languages of the enslaved people transported to South Africa were diverse and included Buginese, Javanese, Malagasy, and Tamil. In the 18th century, there were three main languages spoken at the Cape: Dutch, Malay, and Portuguese Creole. The later two were languages spoken throughout the harbors of Indian Ocean at the time. During the 19th century, Malay and Portuguese were completely replaced by Afrikaans. This new language developed as a result of enslaved and indigenous people trying to communicate with the European settlers. There's evidence that Afrikaans was spoken in mosques. The first example of written Afrikaans was in Arabic script. These manuscripts were mainly Muslim religious texts, but also included letters. Afrikaans contains many words that came from the Asian languages spoken by enslaved people.
Enslaved people at the Cape also had a big influence on the kind of food South Africans eat. People often refer to the Indian and Indonesian influences on South African cuisine. The origin of some South African recipes can be seen in the names of food. For example, sasatis, bredi, curry, bobotie, koeksisters, and tamalakis. Enslaved people built many of the old buildings that date back to the Dutch colonial period. For example, the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town, and the houses on many Cape wine estates, such as Groot Constantia, Vergelegen, and Simonsig, as well as ordinary dwellings in Cape Town and surrounding areas. Enslaved people also constructed the basic infrastructure of Cape Town and established the thriving fruit, wine, grain, and fishing industries. Many of the white colonists at the Cape became very wealthy as a result of slavery, their prosperity being comparable to that of some of the richest people around the world at the time, including Europe and North America. At the same time, slavery resulted in an incredibly racist and unequal early South African society, which laid the foundations for a continued social, racial, gender, political, and economic inequality for many decades to come. Slavery is often associated with the introduction of Islam to the Cape, and today, South Africa's Western Cape province still has a very large Muslim community. Throughout the period of VOC rule, The Cape was used as a penal colony to which political opponents of the Dutch in East Asia were exiled. Many of these political exiles were aristocrats and often learned Islamic teachers. From the 1780s onward, they came to furnish the first imams of growing Muslim community among enslaved people in the Cape. The VOC allowed private, but never public, practice of Islam. In Cape Town, Islam was also regarded as the religion of resistance. Islam was attractive to many enslaved people as opposed to Christianity, the religion of their enslavers. For many enslaved people, Islam offered an entry point into a recognition of their humanity. It offered enslaved connection to an identity prior to capture and exile, a spiritual home. Enslaved people and free blacks met in the houses of Muslim exiles and on the hills around town. By 1832, a third of the population in Cape Town was regarded as Muslim.
A History of Slavery at the Cape was created by us, a group of grade 6 and 7 students at Cedar House Prep School in Cape Town in 2020. We are Hannah,
Angel,
Miller,
Candy,
Sam,
Danica,
Ayala,
Jamie,
Diadone,
Kit, Bella,
Catherine,
James,
Ollie,
and Mac.